Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a recommendation video of historical fiction that intersects with horror. And I will admit that I don't read a lot of historical fiction, so it's not an area that I'm drawn to when it comes to horror, but definitely I have read some of them and I have some good recommendations for you all. Hopefully you will find something new to add to your TBR. Let's get started. First, let's talk about The Terror by Dan Simmons. This is a book that is set in 1945 following the Franklin expedition that goes off to travel through the Northwest Passage. They get stuck in the ice and are forced to survive over a long period of time. Because it is a horror novel, there is possibly something out there waiting for them. And on top of that, they have to deal with the general worries of survival as their food and rations and other supplies begin to run low. This is a very large epic horror novel that takes place over a large period of time, and it is a time period that I am not very familiar with. The story is told a lot in epistolary format, and so you get the chronicles of the crew as they go along, and again their supplies begin to dwindle, and I really did enjoy it. I do tend to prefer horror books that are shorter, so this book was a little bit long for my taste, but with that you get a lot of detail, not just about the horror but also about, again, the time period, what the crew was going through, and I did find it generally quite fascinating. So if you enjoy historical horror, if you enjoy survival horror, this is one that I definitely do recommend. Again, it's a big one, but I do think that it's worthwhile. I'm definitely glad I took the time to read it and would of course recommend it to you. Then switching it up with a more modern book, I then want to talk about Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and this book is set in the 1950s in Mexico, following a young socialite who is going off to investigate what has happened to her cousin. She has heard from her cousin who has recently gotten married, and she's writing home with some strange letters, and so her family asked Noemi to go and find out what is actually happening. She goes there and spends time with the family, and a horror story ensues. Now this one I almost forget is historical fiction because the 1950s doesn't feel that long ago, but I guess technically yes, it does count. And I like the fact that this one is set in Mexico, so it not only gives a different historical period, but also a different place. And so I think that it's interesting to read this book because it is not the 1950s that I know. You really get a different experience in this time period in that setting, and so I like that it brings a diverse cultural aspect to the story that I wouldn't otherwise experience. And as I've said before with many videos, I talk about this book all the time. I really like Noemi as a main character. She's a strong, fierce, feminine woman and really brings a modern idea to the story. So I think, yes, it is set in the past, but I think that she is a woman who is perhaps beyond her years and really speaks her mind and is not afraid to say what she is thinking. And because of that, I found this book to be very refreshing, and I just thought it was a really good blend of Gothic themes, but with a much more modern twist on it, which of course appeals to someone like myself who does tend to prefer more modern horror. Next up, we have Dread Nation by Justina Ireland, and this is a book that is set right at the end of the Civil War in the United States. We follow a young Black woman who is trained to work as a protector for her female white companions that she is in charge of keeping safe. And this story is, as I mentioned, set during the end of the Civil War, but the Civil War ended differently because there was a zombie outbreak, which of course changed the course of history. Now, I like the story for a few reasons, one being the fact that I am biased to enjoy a good zombie story, but I will encourage you that do not love zombie books as much as I do to still give this one a try, because at the same time I feel like this one is very character focused and it really gives a great insight into the racial and other historical aspects that were happening during that time period. As I am Canadian, which I know I can barely get through a video without mentioning, but because of that, I was not as familiar with the details of the Civil War and that time period, so I did find it really fascinating. And again, I think it addresses a really important topic when it comes to the racial prejudice and separations that were happening at that time period, and it just uses the zombies as a way to reflect back on humanity and the horrible aspects of humanity, because of course in a lot of times in this book you're going to find that the people are far worse than the undead creatures in here. So highly recommend this one. It is technically young adult, but I do think that it appeals to readers of all ages, and I especially recommend continuing on to the second book, Deathless Divide, which is a personal favorite of mine, so highly recommend. Then we have One for Sorrow by Mary Downing Hahn, and this is a middle grade horror book that is set in 1918, so it not only addresses the First World War, but also the outbreak of influenza at that time. The story follows a young girl who is going to a new school. At first, she makes friends with a girl that she finds out is not so popular, and she does not really like this girl, so she ends up ditching her to go and befriend the more popular girls at school. They are very mean to this other girl, and they taunt her and just make fun of her. Eventually, that other girl gets influenza, and this is on the back of the book, and something terrible happens, and the story turns into a haunting story or a ghost story. And I really like this book. Again, I think it's one that will appeal to readers of all ages because I thought it was very well done. It's not the scariest horror book, but it is one that I liked, and largely because of the historical aspects. I was not as familiar with that time period. I find that I've read a lot more historical fiction that is set around World War II. So I wasn't as familiar with the time of the First War, and specifically it was very topical to have the discussions about the outbreak of influenza because it's very topical to the recent events of our day and age. And so I thought it was very interesting to see how it was treated, how people were isolating and separating themselves, and how children were just being treated differently in order to protect them from this. And so I thought it was insanely topical. And I am also a huge fan of books involving mean girls because it is something very near and dear to my heart, something I've experienced, and I thought it was very well done in this book. The characters are not perfect. They are definitely morally gray or questionable in their choices, and I loved it a lot. I thought it was really well done and incredibly complex for a middle grade novel. So again, one that I think that readers of all ages will be able to get quite a bit out of. It is not a simple story, but one with a lot of detail built in. Then we need to talk about Slewfoot, A Tale of Bewitchery by Brom. And this is a story set in the Puritan age in North America. And we follow a young woman who at the beginning of the story, her husband dies. And so because of the rules of the colony, she is being told to marry again, but she does not want to. And so she becomes a bit of an outcast. She is called a witch. And then she possibly makes friends with a creature called a Slewfoot that is possibly also a bit of an outsider. And the story goes from there. I will admit that this is a book that I appreciated a little bit more than I personally enjoyed, but I think for those of you that really love historical fiction set during this period, you will absolutely enjoy this one because I'm just not a fan of Puritan fiction in any format. But I will say that this book was incredibly well written. The character work, the themes, all of that I thought was very well done. And if you're not familiar with Brom, he illustrates his own books. And so there are creepy illustrations all throughout the story. I know a lot of people love the audiobooks, but this is a case that I do recommend getting the physical book because you can just get some beautiful creepy imagery that for me, I think really enhances the story. So this is definitely one that I recommend again to those of you that love historical fiction, that love the Puritan era. I think that you will absolutely love this one even more than I did. I just know that I'm not the target audience for this, but if you are the target audience, I definitely think you should pick this one up and hopefully love it as much as I think you will. Next, we have a personal favorite of mine, and that is The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Kristen White. And this is a young adult horror book that centers around the adopted sister of Victor Frankenstein, Elizabeth. And so she gets brought into his family. She is not quite a sister to him, but something else. And they get wrapped up in one of the most toxic relationships that I've ever read, and I loved it so much. We follow them over the course of time because we get to see their childhood as they're growing up together. And then the book opens with her trying to find him as an adult, seek him down, and find out what he is up to, which you can imagine given the fact that this is a retelling of Frankenstein. And I love this book a lot. I don't have the specific date when this would have been set, but obviously at the same time period of the original Frankenstein story. And normally I don't love Gothic fiction, but this one just had enough of a modern twist. I thought it had some really great sensibilities to it, and I loved it so much because it was so dark and gruesome and twisted. And so again, I think that this one I would really recommend to those of you like myself that aren't normally drawn towards historical fiction. I think that this one was very accessible, and I've said before that this is a young adult book that I really think works for readers of all ages because it doesn't have the classic tropey YA romance that normally makes me roll my eyes. Instead, this is quite something else and was really well done. Then I want to talk about The Winter People by Jennifer Jennifer McMahon, and this is a book that is set over two timelines, one being the present day and one being the beginning of the 1900s, where we follow a couple who are recently mourning the loss of a terrible tragedy. After years of infertility, they've been able to have a child and something terrible happens, and then there is perhaps the possibility to bring that child back to life and terrible things ensue. I think that this book is great to recommend for those of you like myself that don't normally pick up historical fiction because of the fact that only half the story is told in the past, and again the other story is in the present day, where we follow two young girls that are living in a blizzard where their mother has disappeared, and so they're trying to track down what happened to her and investigating secrets within the house, and the stories of course tie together eventually. But I really enjoyed the historical perspective on this one, and that was just because I really connected with the parents, their loss, their grief, and the desperation of what they would do for their child. And I do think that this book also works well for the fact that while it is set in this historical period, and it is correct and timely for that, it doesn't get too far into the details of the time period. You don't get bogged down by historical facts that are going to slog down the story, but it really does address how women were treated during that time, the treatment of their hysteria, and how men were very much the leaders of their households, and you get to see how that plays out. So I think this book is very timely once again. It's a favorite of mine and definitely one that I'd recommend for those of you that are looking to kind of dip your toes into historical fiction without going too far into the deep end. Finally, we have Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark, and this is a book that is set in 1915, and it is a cosmic horror novella with elements of fantasy that is set right during the birth of the KKK, and we follow a young black girl who describes herself as a monster hunter, because in this world the KKK are not just terrible human beings with terrible philosophies, but they are possibly real-life monsters, and so it takes a bit of a supernatural twist on that, and you have this bright young girl who has to fight against the monsters. This is not a personal favorite of mine, but definitely a very topical one because of the issues that it addresses, and so I do absolutely recommend it for those of you that are looking for some diverse horror that is set during a different time period, because it really infuses the history into the story itself and becomes very important to the narrative. So definitely one that you might want to check out. I know it is a favorite of a lot of readers, so if you haven't read it yet, it might be time to do so. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to hear of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? I'd also love to hear what are your favorite historical horror novels. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror as well as thriller, science fiction, and fantasy. You can help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online, dropping a comment, even if it's just a little emoji, and you can also hit that little notification bell so that you never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.